Hello everyone. In this video, I want to show you how you can use the graphical user interface tools in the popular lightweight IDE or integrated development environment called VS Code to submit your assignment to GitHub Classroom. GitHub Classroom is an increasingly popular tool that educators are using in order to collect students' code submissions for programming assignments. Instead of creating a zip file and uploading that to your learning management system like Blackboard or Canvas or Moodle, you can instead just commit and push your code to GitHub. So it's a really great tool for collecting assignments from the instructor's perspective, and it's a really great tool for the students as well because they get extra practice working with version control systems like Git and GitHub. All right, so what I'm showing here now is essentially a really short playlist I've created, or I'm slowly creating, called Gina's Git Crash Course. And in here, I've got quite a few existing videos for how to submit assignments to GitHub Classroom. I want to go through those really briefly so that you know this is the right video for you. So first off, towards the bottom, I've got a video called How to Use VS Code to Submit an Assignment to GitHub Classroom, which sounds exactly like what the video I'm making right now was supposed to do. But this one is for working with code repositories that are initially empty. So when you're going to submit an assignment to GitHub Classroom, your instructor provides you an invitation URL. You open that URL and it prompts you to accept the assignment, and then it creates a repository for you in your class's organization. Now, if your instructor has not provided any starter code like code files, input data files, unit tests, etc., then that repository is going to be initially empty. And what you do to start working locally is you create a folder on your local machine and you run git init. Now, in this video, I show you how to do that using VS Code and initialize the repository, commit, push, etc. But what if your instructor has starter code for you, meaning when your repository is created in that organization, it's not empty. There are some files and folders in there. Well, in that case, you're not going to run git init or initialize repository in VS Code. You're instead going to start off by cloning that repository because it's not empty. It's got some files and folders in it that you need to get locally on your machine to start developing. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. It'll be a somewhat short video where I'm going to show you how to use the graphical user interface tools in VS Code to submit an assignment to GitHub Classroom that has starter code. While I'm here, I'll point out a few other videos that might be more of what you're looking for, or perhaps something to look into later. First off, I have an equivalent of this video using Xcode, which is Apple's IDE or integrated development environment, also with an initially empty repository. And then up towards the top here, I have two videos for doing all of this from command line, meaning not using any graphical user interface tools or IDEs, instead doing it all from command line, which you might know as terminal or command prompt. So I've got an initially empty repository here where you run git init first, and I've got one with starter code here where you run git clone first. All right, hopefully that provides a nice overview of what we're trying to accomplish in this video and what other videos might be relevant for you. All right, so we're gonna do what we did in this video, but using starter code. All right, so let's open a new tab, and if you have a URL from your instructor for a GitHub Classroom assignment that has starter code, go ahead and open it in this new tab. Or for the purpose of this video, I've created a GitHub Classroom assignment that has some starter code, and we can use this invitation URL. So if I open it, it's going to prompt me to accept the assignment, Hello World Classroom PyTest. This is what I called it. It says, once you accept the assignment, you'll be granted access to this repository in this organization. And note that the repository name is the name of the assignment with dash your GitHub username on the end. So I'll click accept this assignment. Now, if your instructor's provided starter code, This may take a few seconds or a few minutes depending on the size of that starter code. So this is pretty small starter code. I'll refresh and see if it's ready to go. And it is. All right, so we've got a link to the repository. I'll click on this, and here's the repository. All right, so some things to note here. This is not an empty repository. If it's an empty repository, you'll see that classic GitHub screen where it's got instructions for how to get started working locally and then push your code to this remote repository. This is not empty, so we've got two files here, a Git Ignore file and a Python file. The Git Ignore file is just a nice file that tells Git what files to ignore when you go to add files to the staging area, which essentially tells Git which files it should be tracking changes in. If you haven't worked with Git Ignore files before, no worries, you can ignore this Git Ignore file. All right, secondly, there's a Python file here. If you haven't worked with Python before, no worries. The point of this video is not to teach you Python, but to show you how you can get started with a non-empty repository in VS Code. All right, so here's what we need to do. We need to go to this green code button and copy this URL. Okay, we're going to clone or make a copy of this remote repository on our local machine. So to do this, we need to copy the URL that uniquely identifies this GitHub repository. Now head over to VS Code. And if your VS Code doesn't quite look like mine, that's probably okay. One thing I would encourage you to do is if you have a folder already open in VS Code, go File and Close Folder. File, Close Folder. Once you've closed the folder in VS Code, there's no current working directory that VS Code is operating out of. You'll likely see this welcome page, but only if you have this box checked on the welcome page itself, show welcome page on startup. So if you don't see this welcome page, don't worry about that. What you can do now is in the left sidebar, there's some icons here. The top one is called the Explorer. If you click on the Explorer, it's going to show you essentially the folder that you have open and its contents. Well, since we don't have a folder open, it prompts us with some options in order to open a folder. So this second one is the one we're interested in. It says, you can clone a repository from a URL. Bam, that's what we have, a repository and a URL. And then if you want, you can learn more about how to use Git and source control in VS Code by reading the documentation. So there's a great resource there if you want to learn more. So we want to click this blue Clone Repository button. I'll also note that on the welcome page, you can click Clone Repository here. All right, now we're going to paste that URL and choose when it says Clone from URL and that URL. Fantastic. Now we just need to choose a location for this local repository. Remember, cloning is going to make a copy of this remote repository on your local machine. So where do we want that local copy to live? All right, I'll just leave it here in my home folder, but you can and should put yours perhaps on your desktop or in a folder for your class. All right, in the bottom right-hand corner, once it's cloned the repository, it says, would you like to open it? And we most definitely would like to open it. So we can open it in this window or create a new VS Code window. I'm going to open it in this window. So what happens is VS Code refreshes itself, and now in our Explorer, our open folder or our current working directory we're operating out of in VS Code is that local repository. So hello world classroom, pytest, dash, and then your username, gsprint23 in this case. You can see in this folder, I have two files, gitignore and average.py. So these are local copies of these two files here up in the cloud. All right, so we just learned how we can get our remote repository that has starter code in it down on our local machine in VS Code where we can start writing code to complete our assignment. I'll note one more time how we know that this code has, or this repository has starter code. It's because there are files and folders here, and we're not prompted with instructions for how to set up a local repository. I'll also note that at the top, it tells you that this repository has been generated from another repository. Now, this is a private template repository, so if you try and open it, you won't be able to see it, but you know what's in here. These two files, right? These are copies of two files in this repository, and then these are copies of these two files. All right, so that's kind of the minimal example to get started working locally in VS Code with a starter code repository for Github Classroom. Let's finish this little mock assignment, and I'll show you how you can commit and push your code to GitHub to submit your assignment. All right, if I open average.py, this is just a little dummy Python file that I made for the sole purpose of this example. It's got one function in it called compute average, which takes a list of values, and it should compute the average of those values. But right now, it's just stubbed out, and it always returns negative 1.0. Then I've got a PyTest test function that is going to test compute average. This is a unit test. It's going to test the compute average unit. So I've got two assertions in here to make sure that the implementation of this function is correct. So let me show you how you can run the unit test. So first, up in the upper right-hand corner, there's a play button that says Run Python File in Terminal. This is one way to run a Python file. Okay, I run it. There's seemingly no output. That's because my main function here has a pass in it. It doesn't do anything. But this brings up a terminal, and there are a few other ways to bring up a terminal, notably view terminal. So now with the terminal open, I can do pytest -- verbose. This is a flag I like to set so that you can see as much output from pytest as possible. And then the name of the Python file that has a test or one or more tests in it. So I'm going to do pytest -- verbose average.py. Okay, collected one item. There's one test in here. Average.py, test compute average. It failed. Okay, so the first assertion fails. We're getting negative 1.0 when we should be getting 1.5. That makes sense considering we haven't implemented compute average yet. So let's implement it. So let's return the average of these values. So what is the average of a list of numeric values? Well, it's the sum of the values divided by the number of values. So let's save this, and then let's run the unit test again. And now it says that test compute average passed. Awesome. So we're pretty confident that we implemented the body of compute average correctly since we passed the test. Furthermore, your instructor might want you to use this function as part of kind of a larger coding task. Perhaps in main, you might want to write your own code to call compute average. So I can do that really quick here. So let's call compute average, and we'll pass in a list of values for which we know what the solution average should be. So 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus 3 is 6. So that's the sum of a list of the values. There are 3 values here, so 6 divided by 3 is 2. The average of this list is 2. And because we're doing floating point division right here, the result's going to be 2.0. All right, so I can just hit the play button here to run average.py, and there's 2.0. I can also just invoke Python directly and do python average.py. All right, fantastic. Okay, so let's say we are done with our assignment, and now we want to push our code to GitHub to turn our assignment in. How do you do that? All right, well, you can do it from command line, or you can do it using the graphical user interface tools in VS Code. So on the left side of VS Code, below the Explorer, below search, there's a source control icon, and it's got a little badge on it saying one pending change. So if I click this, then in my sidebar, I'm going to see the source control panel. So here I can see average.py has an M next to it, meaning it's been modified. So I can write a commit message to package up all the changes that are listed here and put a label on those changes. So I'm going to say finish assignment passed test. Okay, and I'll hit Command Enter in order to make this commit. It says there are no stages to commit. Would you like to stage all your changes and commit them directly? And I'll say yes. And I'll note that if you are on Windows or Linux, it'll tell you what the shortcut is here in order to make the commit. So on Mac, it's Command Enter, but on Windows and Linux, I think it's Control Enter. All right, now there's no more changes. Our badge is gone here, okay? But I want to note that we just made a commit, okay? So we've just kind of packaged up all of our changes and put a label on it locally. We haven't pushed those changes up to our remote repo. Like if I come over here and I refresh this, okay, my last change was 12 minutes ago, and my commit here, my most recent commit, still says the initial commit that was essentially inherited from the starter code commit. All right, so I need to push these changes up to my remote repo. So a few different ways to do this. One is you can go to the three dots here, more actions, and you can see there's pull push, and you can simply do push. You can also come down to the bottom left-hand corner, and there's a little status bar down here with some information about your local and remote repository. So you can see here, if I hover over this 0 down, 1 up, it says push 1 commits to origin master. So here's another way to initiate a push. So I'll click this. You can see my progress bar spinning here. And then the 0 down, 1 up goes away because our most recent commit locally is now in sync with our commits in our remote repo. I'll refresh this page. And now right there, my most recent commit on average.py is finish assignment pass test. And there's my solution code ready for grading. All right, that wraps up this video. Recall that this video is going to be in this playlist here. It'll be named something really similar to how to use VS Code to submit an assignment to GitHub Classroom, but not for an initially empty repository, for a repository with starter code. Thanks for watching, everyone.